Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's In-House In Focus session. We're delighted to welcome you to this webinar on demystifying governance. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping points to run through. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording and slides with you afterwards. If you've got a question, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to answer those at the end of the session. Any we don't get to, we will try and follow up with you directly after the webinar. We'll also be running a couple of quick polls during the session, and your responses would really help shape the conversation. And finally, after the webinar, a short feedback survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd really appreciate if you could take a moment to share your thoughts. It's really helpful to us to ensure that these sessions are relevant to you. Here's a quick look at what we'll be covering today. So we'll start by unpacking what governance actually involves, and just as importantly, what it doesn't involve. There are often a lot of assumptions around governance, so we'll aim to bring some clarity to that. Next, we'll look at when and why it's worth reviewing your governance arrangements, whether that's in response to change, risk, or simply good practice. We'll then move on to look at how to go about conducting a governance review, what that process can look like in practical terms, and also provide you with some key resources. We'll then explore the role of in-house counsel in strengthening governance frameworks, both in terms of oversight and influence. Then we'll highlight some common pitfalls that we see in governance with the clients we're working with, and more importantly, how to avoid them. Finally, we'll wrap up with a quick summary and open the floor for Q&A. To kick things off then, we'd really like to hear what your take on governance is. It can mean different things to different people. So what does it mean to you? You'll see 6 options on screen. Is it ensuring compliance with laws and regulations? Is it managing risk and internal controls? Setting direction and overseeing performance? Approving policies, signing off decisions? A bit of all of the above? Or honestly, I'm not quite sure. And there is no right or wrong answer here. This is just a chance to reflect and see how we each interpret governance in our roles. So a little bit of a spread of results, but obviously overwhelmingly E. It is a little bit of everything. And I think as in-house counsel, that's quite common because you're responsible for so many different aspects when it comes to governance, and it shows also how broad and interconnected that governance can be. Sorry, have I just stopped sharing the slides? No, I haven't. Here we go. Okay, so what does governance actually involve? Well, it's easy to think of governance as just policies and procedures, but in reality, it is much broader than that. At its core, governance is about how decisions are made, who makes them, and how accountability is maintained. It's all about the framework that supports effective leadership, provides clear oversight, and alignment with the organization's purpose. It also involves oversight, not management, of risk, compliance, and performance. And the distinction between oversight and management is key. As we often say to clients, governance is about nose in, hands out. We also need to monitor and evaluate board effectiveness. That includes not just ticking boxes, but asking, is the board making sound, well-informed decisions? Does it have the right mix of skills and experience to achieve our organisation goals? And is the board operating as effectively as it should be? And finally, governance is also about upholding transparency and integrity. And that means having clear policies, strong procedures, and ethical frameworks in place. It's about making sure everyone understands their role and responsibilities and that decision-making processes are open and well structured. Now, just as important as understanding what governance does involve is being clear on what it doesn't involve. Governance doesn't mean managing staff or operations. That is the job of executive leadership. Governance is about overseeing, not execution, and I can't stress that enough. It's also not about micromanaging decisions. Governance should provide a framework for decision making, but it should not dictate every move. And it's definitely not about rubber stamping. Effective governance involves challenge, scrutiny, and constructive feedback. It's not just about compliance or signing off board minutes. It's about asking the right questions and holding leadership to account. It's also not about doing the work itself. Governance isn't about getting into the weeds of day-to-day operations, or as another saying goes, it's about steering, not rowing. And when governance bodies start to row, they risk blurring accountability and undermining the very structures that they've put in place and are meant to oversee. And finally, governance isn't a one size fits all. What works for a multinational won't be suitable for a charity or a startup. And governance should be proportionate and tailored to the organization's size and other contextual influences, such as its sector. Now, this slide shows a tool that we often use when we're talking to clients and we're explaining governance to them. We would suggest that you could use this tool when your internal conversations in your organizations, when you're talking perhaps, for example, to the board about governance. And it's just a really helpful way to visualize the different layers that shape governance in an organization. So at the base, we have the minimum, the law and the regulations. This is the non-negotiable foundation of governance. It's the statutory regulatory requirements that every organization must comply with. This also includes things like directors' duties under the Companies Act 2006 or trustee duties under the Charities Act. Moving up, the middle layer represents contextual influences. So these are the factors that shape how governance is applied in practice. They include things such as organization size, its sector, ownership model, risk appetite, and culture. For example, what works for a listed company in perhaps the energy sector is going to look very different to what works for a public body or for a small owner managed company. And at the top of the pyramid, we have best practice. And this is where organizations go beyond the minimum, adopting principles-based frameworks and processes, for example, the Nolan principles in the public sector or the Waits principles in the private sector. And running through all of these layers in this pyramid is a set of core principles that, regardless of the sector, regardless of the context, these do remain consistent across all. And those principles are accountability, transparency, integrity, strategic leadership, and effectiveness. And you will see these principles reflected in many of the key governance, legal, and regulatory frameworks. And we'll be highlighting some of those frameworks later today. The language and the detail might vary, but the underlying principles are remarkably aligned. So good governance isn't just about compliance with law and regulation. It's about building on that foundation to create a structure that's fit for purpose, responsive to context, and aligned with best practice. Here at Mills & Reeve, a question we often get asked by clients is, when should I review our governance arrangements and why? The key thing to remember is that governance isn't static. It's not something that you set once and then forget about. And if it is, then that shouldn't be the case. It needs to evolve alongside the organization. And there are certain moments when it's especially important to step back and assess whether your governance is still fit for purpose. One of the most common triggers is significant change, such as a merger, a leadership transition, or perhaps a period of rapid growth. That's often the points where we get brought in to do a review. These shifts can put pressure on existing structures. They can highlight the need for a fresh look at how decisions are made and how oversight is maintained. Another key moment is in response to risk or failure. Often governance gaps only become visible during a crisis, whether that's a safeguarding issue, financial mismanagement, or a reputational hit. These events can expose weaknesses in oversight and often prompt a review, sometimes even at the request of a regulator. Regulatory change is another driver. In highly regulated sectors, governance needs to keep pace with evolving requirements. A good example comes from the higher education sector, where the introduction of the Office for Students regulatory framework in England brought in new expectations around governance, prompting many universities to review their governance structures. Governance should also be seen as an enabler of strategy. If your organization is launching a new strategy, for example, it's going through a digital transformation or it's expanding internationally, your governance framework will most likely need to adapt to support those ambitions effectively. And finally, there's the importance of routine good practice. We always encourage a proactive approach to governance. Regular reviews, such as the scheduled board effectiveness assessment, are a really valuable way to spot and address potential issues early rather than waiting for a crisis to expose them. Let's take a quick moment to get a sense then of current practice in the room. So this poll question is, when did you last do a governance review? This could include formal board effectiveness reviews, structural reviews, broader assessments of how governance is working in practice. There is no right or wrong answer here. Some organizations will have a regular cycle, others will take a more ad hoc approach, and for some, it might still be on the to-do list. So please go ahead and select the option that best reflects your current approach. So as expected, there's a bit of a mix. Some of you are reviewing regularly, which is great to see. Others are doing it more occasionally. Reasonable chunk of you aren't sure, don't know, that's fine. And those that haven't built it in yet to a regular cycle, you're not alone. And one of the key takeaways from today is that governance reviews, they don't have to be complex or time consuming, but they are most effective when they're proactive rather than reactive. And with that, I will hand over to Neil to discuss how to do a governance review.
Thanks, Jude, and good morning, everyone. I'm thankful the poll didn't say 100% of you have done governance reviews in the last year. Otherwise, this slide would be a bit pointless. This is based on how we've seen governance reviews undertaken by clients internally, and when we've involved them. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but does give you a step plan and hopefully some top tips on each area. So the first areas I'd say define the scope and the output. So clarifying what you're reviewing and why. Are you focused on board structures, decision-making processes, risk management, or compliance with a sector-specific regulation or code of conduct? Or it could be all of the above. And we'll come on to a case study in a moment, but really clear scope. So you're not spending time bringing people back to the scope, and be clear about the drivers. What are you trying to get out of it? And what outputs are you hoping for? Is it in relation to an audit? Is it in relation to a sale? Is it in relation to funding? Just be clear as to, or it's just good governance. In terms of a top tip, I would suggest involving key stakeholders early on to agree the scope. If the board and the executive and the relevant committees aren't aligned, each set is going to want their own different things, and it will take too long, cost too much, and probably won't give you what you want. So be targeted and efficient. Step 2 is gathering the evidence. So collecting in the relevant documentation and data. This might include board minutes, risk policies, registers, audit reports, and beyond the desktop, interviews with key stakeholders, board members, committees, chairs, and can also include observing those boards, committees in action. You learn a lot from that. And obviously, don't forget the desktop element, the key documents like articles of association or key constitution. In terms of a tip, on step 2, use a document checklist to ensure consistency across the review. And I would say this, but it can be helpful to engage an independent third party to conduct the interview stage, if nothing else, because that often encourages more candid feedback with an external as compared to a colleague. Step 3, assess against regulation and standards. So once you have the data, benchmark it against the applicable legal and regulatory standards. So the baseline, as I call it, the kind of Companies Act, corporate governance. Are there any sector specific? So if you're a charity governance code, for university chairs code, or other sector specific rules. And then also consider other frameworks like the Chartered Governance Institute, or indeed peers who you see as being really good at governance. And the tip around this is don't just look for compliance tick box, look for effectiveness. Our governance process is working in practice, not just on paper. And then step 4 is gathering in that data and identifying the gaps and the opportunities. So highlighting the areas of non-compliance, inefficiency or risk, but also looking out for opportunities to enhance governance and be forward-looking. Examples of things that regularly come up. Could decision making be more transparent? Do you have the right skills on the board? Is there enough diversity? Are the roles and responsibilities clearly defined? The tip here is we think works well is using a RAG rating, so red, amber, green rating, and to prioritize issues and opportunities. And then the reporting stage, so reporting with recommendations and an action plan. You might hear me repeat this more than once in the talk, but presenting your findings in a clear, structured report. Keep it simple, practical points, prioritized, with a clear owner for each of those actions. Board support on some of those really strategic actions, with timelines of when they're going to be achieved and what you need to do to achieve them. We found it really helpful when doing those reviews to include a quick win section, some low-hanging fruit that you can tick off that really builds momentum in the process and gives everyone the encouragement to sort of tackle some of those harder issues in the strategic actions list. And then lastly, it's a bit like painting the bridge. Repeat it. So it's not just you get to the end and finish and forget about it. It's not a one-off exercise. Reviews should be done at regular intervals. So build that in to your process. So that the tip around that is, from an in-house perspective, you can build that into your legal and compliance calendar, so it becomes business as usual rather than a sort of one-off hit. And if there's a yardstick, I'd suggest it's good to conduct annual reviews of some sort internally and perhaps bring in someone external every 3 years or so, depending on the sector and the size of the organization. Some useful frameworks. I'm not going to go through all these, but a quick spin around them. So left-hand side are for the corporates. Jude's already mentioned some of those. Some charity checklists there, and then down in the bottom, sector specific. So for universities, health, financial services, and the general Nolan principles of public life. Just moving over to the bottom right-hand corner, some general really useful toolkits, I would say, the Mills and Reeve toolkits, which we'll make available when we send you these slides, a governance self-evaluation tool, and a Mills and Reeve governance policy checklist. And also, I'm sure you're aware of it, but the SRI guidance for in-house solicitors around your duties and reporting issues and how that sits alongside governance. So moving on to a case study, and I thought this is helpful. It's something we've recently done, and lessons learned. Us, the organisation, will hopefully help you if you're involved in a board effectiveness review. So this is a board effectiveness review, how well the board is operating. So not a wider governance review. And the context is it was a global not-for-profit entity, 3 profile high anchor funders. Very experienced board, very experienced leadership, but they'd been changing both. And there was conflict amongst the founders, conflict amongst the board and the executive because the new people were in roles. And it was, I would say, very much the board had their hands in as well as their nose in, and that was causing some friction, and the founders weren't aligned on outcomes. So we were asked to do both, a board of effectiveness review. So we did a desktop review, but the really great information came out in the anonymous survey and then the one-to-one interviews that we did. We went in initially, and this was a sort of 2-day process, half a day with the board, and then we had a further session with the board, and we came up together with the board with 16 action points. Before leaving the boardroom, we'd dealt with 4 of those 16, and we'd got a clear timeline so that the board and the organisation could then look at those more strategic decisions. And then we went back after 6 months to do a review, and I'd say 14 out of the 16 had been achieved and 2 were still work in progress. But it was getting into their kind of rolling program, but definitely it kind of moved them on. So what did they learn during it? Scope creep. So I've mentioned this already. I think when you're doing any kind of review, being very clear to the key stakeholders what you're doing and why. Otherwise, every interview you'll go into, I've found that you quite quickly go off tangent, and you're not doing what you're meant to be doing in that call. So being very clear about the scope, getting early buy-in, and reminding people before you kick off each stage, whether that be an interview or a questionnaire. Managing the personalities, internal politics. I haven't got all the answers on this. I would say just ask the questions. Are there any big personalities? Are there any elephants in the room? How do we manage them? And I guess we've been used to ensure everybody gets a fair say. Otherwise, dominant personalities will sometimes take over. So doing exercises like your latest thinking, where you go around the room, so every board member gets 2 or 3 minutes to, after you've done a session on a review, as to what they're thinking, so it's not dominated by one or two people. I would say this, but I really do believe at times an independent third-party reviewer being involved helps, especially, excuse me, with the candid feedback at the interview stage. And we always suggest that you don't name names. Some people want to be named to say a specific thing, and I think people will be even more candid. So that covers the fourth point as well. And then lastly, I suggest keep it as simple as you can, keep it action focused. And I should have mentioned this at the start. I think when setting out the scope, make it very clear this is not a blame game. This is not about, naming and shaming. This is about looking at the evidence, what's happened, and how we can learn from it and move forward. So next slide. So where do you come in? These are just 5 things based on number of conversations with some of you. I'm sure your role is much broader, but I'm just trying to distill this down into 5 points. So firstly, providing legal and regulatory insight, so insurance governance structures comply with laws, regulations, and sector-specific codes. Secondly, around identifying mitigating risks, so that horizon scanning, seeing what's coming down the track, spotting those legal and reputational risks, such as unclear delegations and conflicts of interest. They're 2 points that regularly pop up and cause issues. So just horizon scanning and heading those off before they start. Lead or support governance reviews. When we do many governance reviews, we work hand in glove with in-house counsel, and you certainly are the glue to make sure that they happen and the actions are followed up. Coordinating the evidence gathering, stakeholder engagement, and effectiveness assessments. Then when there are, some of the desktop reviews where there are policies to be updated, clearly you can keep the terms of reference, schemes of delegation, those sorts of things updated and real and flexible and forward-looking. And probably the most important is advising on the implementation. What the last thing you want is a good report to go in the drawer. So see you as the glue to helping translate those reviews and the findings into practical, legally sound actions, and support their roll up. Keep up the process with actions, ownership, and a timeline, and hold people to account if they're not. So some common governance pitfalls. I'm sure many of you have seen many of these, but these are things that sort of we regularly see, and some suggested mitigations. So the first is, it's a regular occurrence between blurring of board and management roles. This quite often happens where there's a change in one of those teams. And I'm not saying the documents will totally fix it, but you can go a long way by keeping the schemes of delegation and defining roles and responsibilities, keeping them tight, keeping them reviewed, and where possible, setting out in black and white, but also how you deal with a grey, where something is going to be blurred, making sure there's appropriate communication channels open so everybody knows who's doing what. Second kind of pitfall is treating governance as a compliance exercise, a kind of bit of a tick box. The key is if there's a gap between policy and practice, shift the focus, not just from box ticking, compliance ticking, but being part of the core strategic value and organizational purpose. If you do governance well, that's only going to help profitability or outputs depending on the organization and being a sustainable organization. Lack of board diversity or skills. Skills is a particular one where they run into governance problems where perhaps the board, broadly speaking, all has the same skills, just making sure you've got that broad range of skills. So sector specific stuff, depending on which sector you're in, but also financial, HR, legal, global, whatever it might be, but just making sure it's well rounded. Ineffective decision-making structures. So that's sort of back up to the blurring board and management roles, but making sure the roles of each governance body, whether you be the board, executive committees, and then the individuals on them, have very clear roles and responsibilities, clear terms of reference. And then sometimes what happens, go to all the effort to do a really good governance review, and then it sometimes just goes into a drawer because business as usual takes over. So I'm sounding like a stuck record, but a key part of the governance review, it suggests, is a sort of one side of A4, clear actions, clear ownership of who's responsible for them, clear timelines, and keep them on the board's agenda so that they get looked at and they get finished. I'm going to hand you back to Jude now to talk you through key takeaways.
Great, thanks, Neil. So we're coming near to the end of the session, so good opportunity to just reflect on the key takeaways from today. Governance is more than compliance. It is about strategic direction, accountability, and ethical leadership. It is not just about ticking boxes or writing board minutes, as often some people think. In-house lawyers are what we call governance enablers. So you bridge the legal, the strategic, and the operational perspectives, and you have a real opportunity to help shape and strengthen governance frameworks and support implementation of the actions resulting from a governance review. Governance should be tailored. So while there are core principles across sectors, and we looked at those, one size does not fit all. And effective governance reflects the organization's size, the sector in which it operates, the complexity, and the stage of growth. Knowing what governance is and isn't, it's about oversight, not operations, direction, not delivery, and challenge, not rubber stamping. As we said a couple of times, nose in, hands out. Reviews are essential, not optional. Governance should be reviewed after change, in response to risk, or part of good practice. And finally, governance adds value when done well. It does support strategic goals. It does help build trust internally, externally. We see it at the other end when it's gone wrong, and that trust, especially internally, has broken down very clearly as a result of poor governance. So it really does build trust when done well and strengthen organizational resilience. So whether you're reviewing annually or you haven't started yet, hopefully today's session is an opportunity for you to think about how governance can be evolved in your context and how you could do a governance review. I've got a couple of minutes now for questions, and I can see quite a few have come in. Just having a look. I can see a good one. Well, they're all good questions, but I can see a good one on a question around striking the right balance between formal structures and policies and procedures and flexibility. And a couple of people have raised this point, and it's a question that we get as well from clients when we're talking to them about governance. And I think it goes to the point that we've talked about how one size doesn't fit all. Governance does need to be proportionate, and it needs to be relevant as well. It needs to be robust enough to provide some clarity and accountability and oversight. I'd say those are the basic needs, but not so prescriptive and not so rigid that it stifles innovation or agility to make decisions. I think regular reviews can help with that. So if you start with the sort of base layer where you do have you have accountability and just clear roles, and then periodically check in as your organization is growing and changing, and take a temperature check, assess, pivot, and move forward. So it is a balance, but ultimately it's all about proportionality.
So I can see another question around what's your advice for in-house legal teams who want to raise governance concerns but are worried about pushback from leadership? Yeah, that's a real concern, and we hear that fairly reasonably. And I think one way to answer that is raising governance concerns, and that horizon scanning isn't about being obstructive. It's about protecting the organization, enabling better decision making, and hopefully enhancing profitability, impacts, outputs, and sustainability. But maybe one way to deal with that as in-house counsel is to frame the issue in terms of risk and value. So rather than saying this governance process is missing, how bad have we been? You might want to sort of flip it round and, be a sort of a horizon scanning forward looking. We've got a gap here that could expose us to regulatory risk, reputational risk, impact profitability, and here's the problem, but here's the solution. That's what you all do day in, day out, but turn it into sort of impact and solution. And if it helps, you can refer to like external standards or codes to say, we'll be out of kilter with these codes, and in particular against you can benchmark obviously against competitors who the board might see as successful and say, we're kind of falling behind here, and that might impact us from a kind of customer profitability perspective. There's another linked question, a good question on we have a few non-execs that sit on our board who naturally have their own experiences of governance from other boards they sit on. When refreshing our governance, they have some views, comments. However, their views are very specific to the sectors, to the other boards they sit on, and not relevant to that sector of that organization. Do you have any advice on how best to manage such views, comments without offending the non-execs? Yeah, it's a good point, and I think it's back to that triangle that Jude mentioned during the start of the presentation. It's the kind of the core good governance. So if you're a company, Companies Act. If there are some sector specific things, if you're a charity, the Charity Governance Code, and then there's general good governance. So I guess my advice would be is to hear out what those non-ex say, because it might be that in another sector they perhaps do something better or different, and your kind of own code probably only gets you to a certain level, and you can learn from other sectors. But I think it's cherry picking the best bits rather than taking the whole thing. So I hope that helps with that question.
And Neil, I would add to that and
Yeah.
say, and I'm not just doing this, to I'm not just trying to plug Mills and Reeve, but bringing in an external party, particularly in a situation or a dynamic like that, can be helpful to just facilitate that conversation without, causing offense to anyone. If there's a concern about that, teasing out, well, okay, that's great to hear about that. How do you think that relates to our organization, this sector, and just facilitating that dialogue? And we've definitely done reviews where we've had some strong personalities in the room. There's been some points perhaps they have seen, certain board members have seen from other roles and other boards or previous experience that they feel very strongly about. We often talk about this as hot potatoes. And I think if you are the one internally leading a review, it can be helpful to, or if you're bringing someone external in, have that conversation up front. Look, these are the hot potatoes. Okay, this person is adamant about this. They're not going to let it go. They've got a bone between the teeth. We don't think it's relevant, and that just helps mitigate any conflict and manage that well during that process.
So we've just got time for one more, Jude. So do you have any observations of the role of the CEO in a medium-sized charity setting if carrying out a governance review? Are they the lead or potentially a hindrance to good process? I wouldn't call the CEO a hindrance. I would suggest that the CEO needs to be part of the kind of the core team and in the tent. Of course, they could be part of a governance issue. So I'd suggest that they're part of the core team, but if you have the resources, they don't lead it, would be so they're involved, but not the lead.
Yeah, agree. Okay, I think that is us running out of time now. So once the webinar ends, just a reminder, there will be a feedback survey pop up on your screen. Please do take a couple of minutes to complete this, so it helps us to ensure the content is relevant to you and it gives you an opportunity to shape that. Our next In-House in Focus session is on the 24th of September, so we're taking a little break over the summer, and it will be also in the theme of governance, but this time governance of investigation. So something has gone wrong, there is an investigation, perhaps instigated by a regulator. How do you do that investigation properly? How do you govern that so that mistakes are not made and it doesn't come back to bite you? And with that, thank you for listening. And if you'd like to explore any aspect of anything we've talked about today or governance generally, please don't hesitate to get in touch with Neil or myself.